Well, let's begin with a word about the biblical data concerning divine omniscience. And I'm going to say something about God's knowledge of the future, 5.13. 5.131 emphasizes the importance of divine knowledge. And to summarize what I say in this section, there are two aspects of divine foreknowledge in the scriptures that make this especially important. One is the prophetic pattern that underlies scripture. God again and again sent prophets to Israel telling what was going to happen. And Jesus himself was a prophet who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of the world, and his future coming again. Secondly, would be God's providential plan over history. In the biblical view, history is not haphazardly unfolding, chaotic sequence of events. Rather, everything that happens is under the providential and sovereign direction of God, so that he knows what will happen in the future. And therefore, God's knowledge of the future, I think, is extremely important. So 5.132 deals with God's knowledge of future contingents, and I want to look at just a couple of passages. The psalmist says that God knows not only the thoughts that you have, but he foreknows the very thoughts that you will have. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest when I sit down and when I rise up. Thou discernest my thoughts from afar. Thou searchest out my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou dost beset me behind and before, and layest thy hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Here the psalmist imagines himself as surrounded by God's knowledge. God knows everything about him, even the words that he will say before he speaks them. So it's little wonder that this knowledge is beyond the reach of the psalmist's understanding. Now, one of the contributions of the New Testament to the doctrine of divine foreknowledge is its introduction of a family of words associated with God's knowledge of the future, such as foreknow, prognosko, foreknowledge, prognosis, foresee, praorao, foreordain, praorizo, and foretell, pramaturomai, prakatangelo. And these words with the prefix very often have to do with God's knowledge of the future, including future contingents. So it's very difficult, I think, to understand how anyone can deny that the God of the Bible has foreknowledge of the future when you have this whole raft of terms introduced by the New Testament referring to God's knowledge of the future. Now, jumping ahead then, I say thus, in the New Testament, as well as the Old Testament, God is conceived as knowing not only all present and past events, but future events as well. This foreknowledge seems to extend to future free acts which could not possibly be inferred from present causes, and which in any case are not so represented by the biblical authors. For examples, one thinks of Jesus' prediction of Peter's threefold denial, or of Judas' betrayal. So in the biblical conception, God's knowledge comprises foreknowledge of future contingents. Moreover, the scriptures make it clear that God also has a sort of hypothetical knowledge of conditional future contingents. That is, he knows what would happen if human beings were to make some free choice in a particular set of circumstances. Such knowledge is even more remarkable than simple foreknowledge. For in the case of foreknowledge, the events foreknown actually do happen. Whereas in the case of hypothetical knowledge, God knows certain subjunctive conditionals about what people would freely do under various circumstances, whether the events ever happen or not. One of the classic examples of such knowledge on God's part is found in 1 Samuel 23, verses 6 to 10, which tells of David's inquiry of the Lord by means of a divining device called an ephod. David asks the Lord whether Saul will attack the city of Keilah, where David is holed up, and whether the men of Keilah will deliver David over to Saul. In both cases, the device, which apparently gave either a yes or no answer, registers an affirmative response, whereupon David flees the city so that the predictions do not, in fact, come true. What the device mediated to David was not therefore simple foreknowledge, but hypothetical knowledge. God was letting David know that if he were to remain at Keilah, then Saul would come after him, and that if Saul were to come after David, then the men of Keilah would deliver him over to Saul. By acting on such knowledge, David was able to save his life and those of his men. The answers given by the divining device were thus correct answers, even though the events did not come to pass, since the answers were indicative of what would happen under certain circumstances. Section 5.2, the concept of omniscient. 5.2. And we'll talk about 5.21, the definition of omniscience. What does it mean to say that God is omniscient? According to Anthony Kenny, the doctrine of omniscience is easy to formulate precisely. It is the doctrine that for all P, if P, then God knows that P. Kenny's definition is more accurately a definition of divine omniscience. We need a theologically neutral concept of omniscience in order to answer our question in an unprejudicial way. Fortunately, Kenny's definition can be easily generalized. For any agent S and proposition P, O1 states S is omniscient, means for all P, if P, then S knows that P. Unfortunately, the situation does not seem quite as simple as Kenny asserts, for O1 does not exclude S as also entertaining any number of false beliefs in addition to those propositions known by S. O1 therefore fails to capture what is meant by omniscience, since if P, it is possible, according to this definition, that S knows that P is true, he knows that not P is false, he knows that P and not P is necessarily false, and yet he believes not P as well as P. So Kenny's definition must be revised to O2. S is omniscient means for all P, if P, S knows that P and does not believe that not P. Omniscience, so defined, is clearly a great-making property, since it is greater to be knowledgeable than ignorant, and so a maximally great being must be omniscient. Therefore, if the property of omniscience is coherent, perfect being theology demands that the God of the Bible should be understood to be omniscient. But when we use the definition O2, it is not meant to tell us the mode of God's knowledge, but simply the extent of his knowledge. That for any proposition P, if P is true, then God believes P and does not believe not P. We come then to 5.3, which is divine foreknowledge of future contingents. Undoubtedly, the most controversial aspect of the doctrine of divine omniscience, both historically and on the contemporary scene, concerns God's knowledge of future contingents, in particular of human free decisions. A surprising number of contemporary Christian philosophers and theologians have denied the traditional doctrine that God possesses such knowledge. Since God lacks both hypothetical knowledge of how things would go if he were to act in certain ways, as well as foreknowledge of how things will in fact go, God can neither predict nor plan the course of future events. As a result, God is ignorant of virtually all of humanity's future, since even a single free choice might turn the course of history in a different direction than its present course. Subsequent events would, as time goes on, diverge increasingly from history's present trajectory. At best, God can be said to make intelligent guesses about what will happen in the near future and then react to events as they happen. He is therefore said to be a risk-taking God. According to some revisionist construals of divine omniscience, God is sometimes wrong in his expectations of the future and therefore makes mistakes, which he later regrets. 5.31, philosophical grounds for affirming divine foreknowledge. Having considered biblical grounds for affirming God's knowledge of future contingents, we now want to ask what philosophical reasons there might be for thinking that God knows the future. Here, an obvious argument from perfect being theology presents itself. For ignorance is an imperfection. All things being equal, it is greater to be knowledgeable than ignorant. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being, a perfect being, must be omniscient. In particular, if there are truths about future contingents, God, as an omniscient being, must know these truths. Since there are such truths about the future, that is to say, since propositions about future contingents are either true or false, and they are not all false, God must therefore know all truths about the future. We can formulate this reasoning as follows. 11, God is a perfect being. 12, any being which is perfect is omniscient. 13, an omniscient being knows all truths. 14, there are truths about future contingents. From these four premises, we can infer 15, therefore God is omniscient. 16, therefore God knows all truths. 17, therefore God knows the truths about future contingents. Premises 11 and 12 seem to be incontestable. By definition, God is a being which is worthy of worship, and no imperfect being could merit such unqualified adoration. Moreover, as a perfection, omniscience would seem to be among the attributes of any perfect being. So the first two steps of the argument are uncontroversial. So the revisionist theologian, if he is to resist the force of this reasoning, will have to attack either 13 or 14. And these two premises lie at the very heart of the contemporary debate. Now, those who want to deny 13, that an omniscient being knows all truths, are therefore forced to come up with a new definition of omniscience, which does not involve knowledge of every truth. Recall the traditional definition of omniscience, O2. S is omniscient means for all P, if P, S knows that P, and does not believe that not P. O2 entails that if there are future tense truths, then an omniscient being knows them. Opponents of divine foreknowledge have suggested revisionary definitions of divine omniscience so that they can affirm that God is omniscient even though he lacks knowledge of future contingents. William Hasker's revisionist definition is typical, and I present that there as 06, but then point out some problems with the way that's formulated and suggest that what the revisionist really wants to say is something like 07. God is omniscient means God knows only and all true propositions which are such that it is logically possible for God to know them. Unlike 06, 07 limits God's knowledge to a certain subset of all true propositions, namely those which it is logically possible for God to know. The fundamental problem with all such revisionary definitions of omniscience as 07 is that any adequate definition of a concept must accord with our intuitive understanding of the concept. We are not at liberty to cook the definition in some desired way without thereby making the definition unacceptably contrived. 07 is guilty of being cooked in this way. For intuitively, omniscience involves knowing every truth. Yet, according to 07, God could conceivably be ignorant of infinite realms of truth and yet still count as omniscient. The only reason that someone would prefer 07 to 02 is due to an ulterior motivation to salvage the attribute of omniscience for a cognitively limited deity, rather than to deny outright that God is omniscient. 07 is therefore unacceptably contrived. Second, the superiority of 07 over 02 depends on there being an intrinsic difference between a truth and a truth which it is logically possible to know. If there is no difference, then 07 collapses back to 02, and the revisionist has gained nothing. But it is far from evident that there is any intrinsic difference. For what is a sufficient condition for a proposition to be logically knowable? So far as I can see, the only condition is that the proposition be true. What more is needed? If the revisionist thinks that something more is needed, then we may ask him for an example of a proposition that could be true, but logically impossible to know. A proposition like, nothing exists, or all persons have ceased to exist, comes to mind. If these were true, they could not possibly be known to be true. But on traditional theism, these propositions are necessarily false, since God is a personal being whose non-existence is impossible. Unless the revisionist can give us some reason to think that a proposition can be true and yet unknowable, we have no reason to adopt 07. It seems that the only intrinsic property which a proposition must possess in order to be logically knowable is truth. Now, the revisionist will no doubt claim at this point that propositions about future contingents are logically impossible for God to know. For if he knows them, then they are necessarily true, not contingently true. This is an assertion of theological fatalism, the doctrine that if God knows some future tense proposition P, then P is necessarily true. Now, here we may note that even if we consider the fatalist's argument to be sound, it still does not follow that future contingent propositions are logically impossible for God to know. The revisionist claims that for any future tense proposition P, it is impossible that God know P and P be contingently true. Therefore, he reasons, if P is contingently true, it is not possible that God knows P. Thus, by his revised definition of omniscience, God is exempted from having to know P. But such reasoning is logically fallacious. The two premises, 18, not possibly God knows P, and P is contingently true, and 19, P is contingently true, do not logically entail that 20, not possibly, God knows P. Rather, what follows logically from 18 and 19 is merely 20 prime, not God knows P. In other words, what follows from 18 and 19 is merely that God does not know P, not that it is impossible that God knows P. Thus, even granted the fatalist premise 18 that it's impossible that God know P and P be contingently true, it does not follow from the contingency of P that P is such that it is logically impossible for God to know P. Therefore, even on the defective definition, 07, proposed by the revisionist's God turns out not to be omniscient, since P is a true proposition which, so far as we can see, is logically possible for God to know, and yet God does not know P. Thus, on the proffered redefinition of omniscience, the revisionist must deny divine omniscience and therefore reject God's perfection, a very serious theological consequence indeed. So, revisionist theologians, unwilling to abandon God's perfection, have in the end no choice but to deny 14, that there are truths about future contingents. That is to say, they must deny that any future tense contingent statements about events in all but the immediate future have the truth value true. So let me ask if there is any discussion over God's foreknowledge of future contingents.
Yes, Dr. Craig. So I think you mentioned something about this, but I think it was quick, so I think I missed it. Regarding premise 13, so let's say that somebody accepts 14, that there are truths about future contingents, but about omniscient being knows all truths. So the revisionist might say God knows only all true propositions which are such that it is logically possible for God to know them. But what if the proponent of this view says the additional criteria for logical possibility, you were talking about they have to add some additional criteria.
Yeah.
What if they say that it's actual truth, and so therefore it's not logically possible for God to know something that's merely potentially true? Could they say something like that? Or what would the problem be?
I don't think that will work at all, because what O2 requires is that God knows every proposition that is actually true. So we're not talking about propositions that are potentially true. We're talking about propositions that are actually true, and that he must know them all. And what the revisionist wants to say is that there are actually true propositions that God doesn't know, but that doesn't count against his omniscience, because he needs to only know those actual truths which it is logically possible to know.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's take a question from online from Robert Forrest. He just wants to know if he's got omniscience correct. He says, God's omniscience, is this correct? God's cognitive excellence encompasses 1, omniscience, innate propositional, P and not P. 2, appropriate innate self-knowledge, non-propositional, for example, I am God. And 3, appropriate learned self-knowledge, non-propositional and only since incarnation. For example, I know how it feels to be hungry, tired, crucified. So he wants to know if those 3 encompass.
Yeah, he is dealing with things that I skipped over in the lectures. O2, the traditional definition of omniscience, defines omniscience in terms of propositional knowledge. God knows all the facts there are. He knows all the truths there are. But in addition to that, there does seem to be a type of knowledge that is non-propositional. And this would be, for example, self-knowledge, that I am William Craig. Cameron can't know that. He can know he is William Craig, or you are William Craig, but he cannot know I am William Craig because he's not. And I can't know I am Cameron Bertuzzi, even though I can know he's Cameron Bertuzzi. And so if you say that this type of self-knowledge is propositional, the consequence would be that there are these purely private propositions which no one else can know, which seems bizarre that there would be a no access permitted sign in front of these propositions. So most philosophers want to say that this type of knowledge is non-propositional knowledge. This is knowledge de se of the self. And there are other kinds of examples of non-propositional knowledge. And he mentioned it in there, for example, how it feels to be crucified and things of that sort. And in order to be omniscient, God doesn't need to have all non-propositional knowledge. Clearly, that would be an imperfection, not a perfection. If God really believed I am Cameron Bertuzzi, he would be grossly mistaken. And if he believed he's also Bill Craig, he'd be in real trouble. So what God needs to have is appropriate non-propositional knowledge for himself. And so I think it is correct to say that God's propositional knowledge does not exhaust his cognitive excellence, as the questioner put it. This was quite an insight to me when I did my study of omniscience, that God's cognitive greatness exceeds even omniscience. He's greater than omniscient because he has not only all propositional knowledge, but he has appropriate self-knowledge as well. And so, yes, I would agree with what the questioner affirmed about God having appropriate non-propositional knowledge.
So Deuteronomy 18:21 through 22 gives a test for a prophet. And it says, if the prophet says something that does not come true, then you shall not listen to this prophet. But if God does not know future contingents, then that would necessarily undermine all prophetic gifts, including Jesus' own, would it not? And how would an open theist respond to that?
Well, if you look at the portions of the chapter we skipped over, I go into this in some detail. And what they will typically say is that these prophecies represent either statements on God's part about what he himself will bring about. I will do this. And he can determine that and so say that with confidence, that this is going to happen because I'm going to bring it about myself. Or it can be an inference from present causes that he extrapolates into the future and predicts in that way. That's not a very convincing answer when you think of Jesus' prediction that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crows twice. I mean, I could imagine he'd predict Peter would deny him on the basis of Peter's rash and perhaps cowardly behavior. But 3 times before the cock crows twice? These are of such specificity that I don't think they can be plausibly explained as extrapolations from present causes. And then the third excuse that they would give was sometimes these are conditional predictions. This is what would happen if things go a certain way, and this is how they would happen if they go another way. The problem with, and I think some prophecies are like that. You think, for example, of Jonah's prophecy, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. These are not strict glimpses of the future, but they are forewarnings of what would happen unless the people repent and change. The difficulty with using that to explain foreknowledge is that that represents this kind of hypothetical knowledge. that we've spoken of, and that's even more difficult to explain than foreknowledge. So that's what they typically say, and I think that those are inadequate explanations for biblical prophecy.
Got a question online from Fred. Is the predominant historical view simple foreknowledge or middle knowledge? If simple foreknowledge, then what did they think about CCFs?
CCFs are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. We'll talk about that later on. The doctrine of divine middle knowledge, as I was saying, I think last night at the dinner, wasn't clearly articulated until Luis Molina following the Protestant Reformation. So prior to that time, church fathers and medieval theologians typically affirmed divine foreknowledge of future contingents. But they didn't have this hypothetical knowledge that is involved in these subjunctive conditionals. This was a genuine insight on Molina's part.
I have a question, if I can word it. I thought about this in Molinism class a couple years ago that I took off and on, and this is a what if. I'm just going to throw it out there. What if the subjunctive conditionals or the counterfactuals were not necessarily human choices, but events that would have to take place? So say behind you is a brick wall, God in all of his omniscience, each one of these, each person has a number of choices that they have to make every single day of their life. It's God's will for certain things to happen. I often think, for some reason, my mind always goes to, God knew that McDonald's was going to exist, and he knew that there's a certain number of people that would choose to bring that McDonald's into existence, that franchise into existence. He gave each one of them the free will to make that decision, but there were unlimited number of decisions that they could have made, and they could deny that. And so instead of possible worlds, could we have possible choices or even possible events?
Absolutely. That is part of middle knowledge, because Molina was a libertarian when it comes to freedom. So he didn't think your choices were necessary. There are possible worlds in which Judas, in the very same circumstances, doesn't betray Jesus, or Peter doesn't deny Christ in the courtyard of the high priest. So absolutely, there are these possible worlds where things go differently.
So my hang-up is...
Oh, could I just say one more thing? I thought you were going to go in a different direction, because you began by saying, are these just about human free choices? And I was going to say that if there is such a thing as quantum indeterminacy, if that's not just epistemic, but ontic, then there would be what Alfred Freddoso calls counterfactuals of quantum indeterminacy as well, that God would know. So he knew that if this radioactive particle were in this particular set of circumstances, it would decay precisely at this time, even though that's indeterminate.
Yeah, I guess my hang-up would be the possible worlds versus possible events. Do we need possible worlds if we have possible events? Do we need a possible world?
Molina is exercised, as we'll see, to give a robust account of divine providence and sovereignty over against the Protestant reformers who denied libertarian freedom. And so Molina wants to talk not just about individual events going certain ways, but God's sovereign control over whole orders of events and complex constellations of events. So he didn't have the lingo of possible worlds, but that's clearly what he meant when he talked about the orders of things that God could decree.
So you said in response to this question that there's a possible world where Judas does not betray Jesus in the same circumstances, trying to talk about libertarian free will.
Right.
It just made me think, Middle knowledge would say that God knows what any free creature would do in any circumstance. So is there really an actualizable or world or feasible world in which Judas does not betray Jesus, or is that just mere possibility?
That's a mere possibility.
Okay.
It's
Okay, I
not
just want to clear
feasible
that
for
up.
God, because the set of counterfactuals that God is confronted with includes the counterfactual: if Judas were in these circumstances, he would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver.